On this edition of the Correspondents, Mosul's iconic Al-Nouri Mosque and its leaning minaret destroyed by Islamic State militants as Iraqi forces attempt to eradicate the terror group from one of its last remaining strongholds. The U.S. congressional probe into Russian meddling in the 2016 election continues, with more hearings on Capitol Hill and more tweets from President Trump. And the World Food Program says the situation in South Sudan is increasingly dire as millions struggle to find just barely enough food to survive. Hello, I'm Milar Sega, and this is the Correspondents on Voice of America. This week, Islamic State militants blew up Mosul's famed Al-Nouri Mosque and then tried to blame it on Iraqi forces. Iraqi generals say the bombing proves the battle for Mosul is almost won. But fleeing civilians and aid groups say the humanitarian crisis in Iraq is far from over. VOA's Heather Murdoch filed this report from the scene of recent fighting in Mosul's Old City.
This is Mosul's Old City, where there has been heavy fighting over the past few days.
You also don't see any civilians around here, as most everyone in this area has fled.
Only a few hundred meters from here, the Al-Nouri Mosque, both the symbolic heart of the Islamic State and an ancient treasure of this region, was bombed last night by IS militants. We can't get to the mosque now because the bomb site is still heavily guarded by sniper fire and mortars. Soldiers say IS wanted to destroy the mosque in advance of an Iraqi and coalition victory over the group in Mosul. Generals from Iraq's elite special forces, or Golden Division, say the destruction signifies the end of the group's power here. Fleeing civilians say inside neighborhoods still held by IS, families are starving, and mortars, bombs, and IS sniper fire are still killing people as they run.
And for an update now on the situation many civilians are up against in the Old City, we are joined by phone in Mosul by VOA Middle East correspondent Heather Murdoch, who of course filed that report for us, and from the Pentagon by our Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb. I thank you both for joining us. Heather, it definitely looks like a war zone there in western Mosul. What's the mood like there? Are you seeing any civilians at all? What's it like walking around western Mosul?
There are very few civilians left in any areas that recently have had battles. The battles recently have been so brutal that every single person ran out as soon as they can, and a lot of people died trying to do so. Outside of the war zone well, it's still technically a war zone, but farther away from the battles, there are some people who have come back, some people that stayed, very few people stayed, but some of the neighborhoods have some shops and a little bit of life, but there's also huge swaths of the city that have been captured by Iraqi forces and are just virtually abandoned. And the only people you see are people going back to their homes to try to gather property that they left when they ran away initially.
Heather,
inside...
Go on. Sorry,
inside the Old City, though, there's still almost 100,000 people, it's believed, to be trapped. And they're coming out of the Old City. They're running away at about thousands a day at this point.
I wanted to talk to you about that, Heather, because in one of your recent reports that I viewed, you said Islamic State is holding thousands of civilians as human shields. Does this perhaps suggest a sense of desperation that, in fact, the area surrounding that mosque may actually be Islamic State's last stand in Iraq? Is there a sense of that?
Yes, there's definitely a sense of that. And the fact that there are so many, they're using so much of their weapons. It seems like they're using everything they can, and they seem to be targeting civilians as much as soldiers. Civilians that start trying to run are getting consistently shot at, far more so than in the past. It seems like there's a sense that they know they're going to die, and they want to take as many people along with them. At the same time, I talked to an Iraqi official today that said there's a lot of militants are also fleeing themselves, disguising themselves as refugees, trying to convince families to say they're with them as they run away. And they apparently arrest 20 to 30 people a day trying to get out that they believe to be Islamic State militants.
Okay, and Carla, let me turn to you now. What does U.S. intelligence have to say about about conditions for civilians in western Mosul? Is there any truth to the fact that some say they're being used as human shields? What's the Pentagon saying about that?
It's a very difficult situation, and the Pentagon has called on Islamic State not to do that, and then they've called Islamic State a very brutal competitor because of those horrific tactics. I don't know if you recall, back in March, the U.S. was actually lured in to striking a target with about 100 civilians, over 100 civilians, when Islamic State put 2 snipers on a roof and then bombed and booby-trapped the entire building. So they herded civilians in, baited the U.S. in with 2 snipers. The U.S. took out those snipers with a bomb that was not even big enough to take down an entire building, nowhere near that. But the entire building was exploded because of that, and more than 100 civilians were killed. This is the brutal tactic, just one of many, that Islamic State has been using, and it makes it very difficult for Iraqi forces trying to get that last bastion. But they are moving slowly, and Iraqi forces do feel that this is the last stand and it is about to fall because of the circumstances and because they were able to bomb that mosque. Now, Islamic State has claimed that it was not Islamic State that bombed the mosque. They say that it was the coalition, but I was speaking to a coalition spokesman just this morning who told me that the United States was nowhere near that mosque. There were strikes being conducted in Mosul, but there were none at that mosque at the time. There's no evidence on their side to support that, and none of the independent sources have come up and supported that claim as well. So it seems like a big lie by the Islamic State.
Right. Carla, are there any reliable numbers on how many Islamic State fighters those Iraqi forces are actually facing off against?
We don't know specifics, but my sources tell me that they are down to just a few hundred fighters. But remember, Mill, a few hundred fighters can go a long way when they are properly supported and propped up. Remember in Sirte, Libya, when Islamic State fighters took just a couple of neighborhoods and they just held on to them for months and months and months. You don't know if this is going to happen, but what we do know is, as Heather pointed out, some of the Islamic State fighters are trying to leave, but the foreign fighters, they can't blend in with the civilian population. They are there to fight and die, and they're going to hold on as long as they can.
Heather, given the sniper fire that we're hearing about around that shattered mosque, what is the strategy for Iraqi forces? Are they essentially just surrounding the perimeter? What's the next step?
There's several different Iraqi forces on the ground fighting, and they work together and they also work independently. They are all slowly moving in, and it was towards the very center, towards that old neighborhood where that mosque is. And they say that it might happen quickly. They might be able to do this within, say, a few days or a week, but they're not willing to put any timeline on it because their main goal is, what they say, is to try to rescue the civilians trapped inside. They've also sort of changed the language on it. They're calling them hostages, not even human shields, not even civilians, hostages. So as they're getting in, as they move forward, they call out to the families when they get close enough, run, and the people run away as soon as they can, and then they move past the houses after the people have run and fight the militants there. That's their strategy anyway.
Carla, in the amount of time I have left, I know you were at the Pentagon for a briefing coming from Baghdad. Are you expecting an update at all on the situation there in Mosul today?
Well, I'm pretty sure that we're going to hear more about Mosul and how it is in its final strongholds. We do not know how long it's going to fall, but I'm sure that they will also reiterate that Mosul is not the end-all, be-all in the fight against Islamic State in Iraq. There are still thousands of fighters on that Euphrates River Valley area between Syria and Iraq. That will likely be the next place that Iraqi forces have to go to push militants out there.
Right. It is a complicated chessboard for sure. My thanks to Heather Murdoch and Carla Babb. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, the latest on the Russia probe and whether the president is recording conversations in the White House. We'll let you know. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
This is BizBeat.
Despite being cut off from the West, Iran's economy is filled with millennials eager to contribute to the country's bottom line. Tech startups like Bamilo, an online shopping network like Amazon, is one example. Hossein Entakabi is the company's chief operating officer.
You know, you always read about the Amazons and how they started from scratch, and you feel that right away here.
The company employs 350 people, mostly in their 20s, and online shopping in Iran is up 34% from last year. Another company, Snap, is another rider app service that now has more than 100,000 drivers. CEO Shahram Shakar.
Our vision is to make it so convenient and so affordable that people will no longer have an incentive to own a personal vehicle.
International sanctions on Iran has given tech startups an advantage to get started and to prosper. For VOA's BizBeat, I'm Philip Alexio.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. Well, U.S. lawmakers continued their probe into Russian meddling into last year's presidential election with 2 hearings this week, one in the Senate and one in the House of Representatives. Lawmakers remain divided over the question of whether President Donald Trump took any steps or abused his authority to obstruct justice. Now, that's an issue that's quickly becoming the focus of a special counsel investigation by former FBI Director Robert Mueller. VOA national correspondent Jim Malone has our report.
One key issue that remains unresolved is whether President Trump himself is under investigation for possible obstruction of justice in connection with the Russia probe. A presidential tweet late last week seemed to confirm news reports that Trump is now a subject of the investigation, with the president adding that he's a victim of a witch hunt. One of the president's lawyers, Jay Sekulow, denied that and said the White House has not received any official confirmation that Trump is under investigation. Earlier this month, former FBI Director James Comey told the Senate Intelligence Committee that the president said, "I hope you can let this go," referring to the FBI's probe of Trump's fired former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Comey said it felt like a presidential directive.
And joining us now for the continuing drama on Capitol Hill, we're joined here in Washington by VOA national correspondent Jim Malone, who filed that report, and of course by VOA congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson. I welcome both of you. It's an important issue that's taking place in the White House there, so we need to get to the bottom of this. Jim Malone, so is the president under investigation or is he not?
Well, we don't know for sure. There's not going to be any confirmation of that from the special counsel, Robert Mueller, who's leading this investigation now. But there's been numerous reports in a number of reputable newspapers that the investigation has broadened to include these possible activities. And some of the things we hear from the president sounds like he believes it as well.
But his lawyers don't. But that may be a defensive position. Catherine, I know you attended, you've been in congressional hearings pretty much the last few months, I should say.
Very true.
What came out of the meeting this week between Bob Mueller and congressional heads? Did anything come out of that?
Right. Well, the important thing for Mueller this week was to head up to Capitol Hill and meet with the Senate and House Intelligence Committees to make sure that their investigations don't conflict with what he has going on as he builds his team. And from everything we are hearing from those Intel Committee heads, those meetings went very well. They've deconflicted their investigations. They know that they're not stepping on each other's turf. So that was a very important step this week.
But we're not expecting to hear anything from Bob Mueller anytime soon.
He's still building his team. It's going to take some time.
He's still building his case. Now, Jim, the other bit of news that came out just Thursday was the president finally ended 41 days of speculation on whether or not he actually was recording conversations at the White House. Why wait so long? And what does he gain from this?
Yeah, good questions, and best directed to the president.
Yeah.
You know, I really don't know what was in his mind on that. You know, one of the effects of that, though, was it caused former Director Comey to, if there were tapes, make sure his memos were out in the public realm.
Sort of backfired.
He leaked that to a source. That
Right.
was, and he, with the idea that in his mind, this would lead to the appointment of a special counsel. Well, guess what? So if you really want to deconstruct this, what may have been an offhand comment or in the form of a tweet by the president maybe embroiled himself deeper in a problem. So, you know, people like to debate whether the tweets are helpful, hurtful in this case. It's not looking good.
Because what I'm wondering is, if you wait 41 days and keep everybody in suspense, don't you squander a little bit of that credibility that you need?
Not if you've been host of The Apprentice on NBC. I mean, this is the mode the president worked in when he was not in politics. And you know what? This is an essential point. He went to Iowa this past week in a campaign-style rally. He's most comfortable as the continuing candidate, getting that embrace of his most loyal supporters, fighting the rhetorical fight, and not worried so much about policy details. It's the essential Donald Trump that we see there, but how much of a cloud over the administration, and how much is he responsible for that himself?
Catherine, to Jim's point, I mean, does the president need an opposition, an enemy for him to thrive? It almost seems like he always wants to blame Democrats, blame Hillary Clinton for something that...
Well, he certainly had an interesting tweet this week after the Democrats suffered some disappointing losses in special elections for House seats. You know, there was a lot of talk on Capitol Hill this week that maybe the leadership of House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi might not be the right fit for Democrats. And Trump tweeted, he said he'd love to see Pelosi kept in that position because it's, quote, good for Republicans.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about, both of you can talk a little bit about this. Democrats are 0 for 4. I mean, they, on all the special elections, how have Democrats sort of miscalculated this scenario? Did they put too much importance, perhaps, on the Russia probe?
You know, I think you have to look at one of the key marquee races in those special elections, the Georgia 6. I went down there to report in April. That is a heavily Republican district. That's been a Republican district for 3 decades. I had the sense that that district was not going to flip and that this was something of a test case for Democrats. They poured all of their money into it, a lot of energy, a lot of grassroots efforts. But in the end, I don't think you could change the essential nature of that district. And that's what a lot of Democrats were saying the morning after that loss.
Jim, is the Russia probe a winning issue for Democrats? Or
well, look,
do people
I think
care?
They look, the Democrats are very excited about the 2018 congressional elections. They think they have a chance to take back the House, maybe the Senate. That might be a little tougher. Point is, they think, or they have thought, the silver bullet was the anti-Trump feeling in the country. It's energized Democrats, and they were expecting to see a wave, especially in that Georgia race, to carry their candidate to victory. Didn't happen. They're going to do some soul searching now. And so the Democratic Party has to kind of reevaluate its own national brand. And the question will be boiled down to, in some cases, is just opposing Donald Trump enough to retake the national agenda? And that's an open question.
Do they need a message, Catherine?
Oh, absolutely. The morning after that Georgia 6 loss, a lot of the younger Democrats I spoke to on Capitol Hill were saying that if you walk down the street and ask 10 people, what does the Democratic Party stand for, you would get 10 different answers. And that's a problem. You can't just be the party that's opposing Trump. You can't just run on anger against Trump. You have to figure out what your message is and get that message out there for 2018.
So Jim, if you could give the president some advice on how to move forward, what would it be? Just stop the tweeting? What would you tell him?
Well, I don't need to give him any advice. I mean, there's plenty of Republicans who would like to give him that advice. It's a constant theme. Even some of his core supporters would like him to dispense with some of that. At the same time, this is how the essential Donald Trump always comes through to his supporters. He's not going to abandon that. Whatever tools he thought got him to win this upsetting victory, upsetting in the terms of no one predicted it, in terms of the presidency, he's going to keep doing it. That's the nature of the man that we've been watching.
So, Catherine, sort of the same question, but with such low approval ratings, 36 or 38%, something in that neighborhood, is that all the president needs to do, is just satisfy his base and never mind the rest of this 62%?
Well, it depends on how long Capitol Hill Republicans stick with him. And so far, when I've been speaking to them about each of these latest revelations in the Russia probe, they say, you know, this is how the president speaks. When he was speaking to Director Comey in the Oval Office, that's just who he is. He's not a politician. He doesn't speak the way politicians speak. And as long as they stick with him on that issue, he has the support he needs.
And I'm afraid the American public are probably getting used to this tactic and sort of giving it free rein, just that the president can do whatever he wants to do. So I appreciate both of you actually covering this issue so closely for both of us. Thank you, Jim Malone, and thank you, Catherine. We're going to take another break right now, but when we come back, the UN says the situation in South Sudan remains critical as hunger and famine threatens millions of people. But first, a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
news and notes. This is Living Better.
These U.S. war veterans are learning golf as part of a program called PGA Hope. Many have never played, but they're using the game to reduce symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, among the most common effects of war. Vietnam War veteran Sylvan Oliveri.
It puts you in a different place. It makes you concentrate, like you concentrate on the ball. So you're not thinking about anything else but that ball. So that period of time is PTSD free.
Golf is a demanding mental game, and that's a reason it can help veterans suffering from unseen pain, says golf instructor Andy Crane.
Learning about PTSD, there's a lot of things that go on in between the ears that we don't get to see. When we have amputees or something like that, we know what the injury is, but we can't really see what people are thinking.
In the United States, up to 20% of veterans of the Iraq War suffer from symptoms of PTSD each year. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. Well, in South Sudan, they're no longer calling it a famine, but as we speak, almost 2 million people are on the brink of starvation from the effects of drought and civil war. According to government and UN reports, an estimated 6 million people, or half the population, are facing the prospects of extreme food insecurity. Now, South Sudan's famine was the first to be formally declared anywhere in the world since the 2011 crisis in Somalia. Now, the UN says the situation in South Sudan remains critical and may actually be getting worse. It warns that removing the label of famine does not necessarily mean conditions are actually improving. In fact, hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese have already fled to northern Uganda, which, as we understand it, currently has an open-door policy for refugees. Now, for some perspective on the conditions many civilians are facing in South Sudan and elsewhere in the Horn of Africa, we're joined here in Washington by multimedia correspondent Salem Solomon with VOA's Africa Division. She's been working tirelessly to inform the world about the crisis in so many parts of Africa and, more importantly, to put a human face on the suffering. I thank you so much for joining us again, Salem.
Thank you for having me.
This is a very important issue. The UN says it's the largest crisis to hit the planet in like more than 70 years. Try to put that into perspective for us. What does that mean to be facing the largest crisis in more than 70 years? What kind of numbers, what kind of suffering are we talking about here?
It's very severe, but as you mentioned in your introduction, there's been promising news coming out of Somalia and South Sudan. Reports are coming out saying that famine has been averted in some parts of South Sudan and Somalia. FuseNet, which is a U.S. government body that tracks food insecurity in these places, say that because of aggressive response in places where there's humanitarian access, limitation of humanitarian access, like South Sudan, they've been airdropping food, and also early detection has really resulted in alleviating the situation. That being said, 4 million people in South Sudan have been displaced because of this, and so what that means is that when people are displaced, the severity and the need for food has increased, and so it's not over yet, but it's just the death toll has been able to go down because of this.
So we're just talking about South Sudan right now, but in fact, this is a problem that stretches out across many countries in Eastern Africa as well as Southern Africa.
That's correct. In Somalia, for instance, 3.2 million people are still at risk. Just this week, we heard promising news, as I said, that famine has been, or looming famine has been. They've been averting because of aggressive response. There's been, but the thing is, malnourished people, kids especially, 350,000 people are still in desperate need of food aid. Northeastern Nigeria is another instance. 8.5 million people who have been displaced because of an insurgent or an extremist group, Boko Haram, have been displaced and they're in severe need of food aid. But there's also positive news in that area, in northeastern Nigeria. What has happened is Boko Haram has been disintegrated because of pushback by the government. This week, there's news that the government said food that was going to the people who are victims of Boko Haram has been diverted. That's euphemism for somebody's stolen it, or it didn't get there. So there's desperate need for food in all of these places.
So I guess aside from the climactic effects of global warming, which I assume is probably one of the causes of this drought, conflict and terrorism appears to be making the problem worse in many parts of Horn of Africa region, right?
That's correct. I mean, in all of these places, either there's an all-out war or there's an attack by insurgency groups. And the thing is, these groups have used it for their own benefit. For instance, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, they've been giving food so that they can win the hearts and minds of people who need it most. So they're using this kind of vulnerable situation to win people back. In South Sudan, and unfortunately, not only warring groups, but also government forces have used food as a weapon of war, meaning starving people so that they can come to them. It's horrible.
I know you feel very passionate about this issue. What has your Africa service and what have you personally been doing to try to get the message out to people? Do you have information about what's going on there in South Sudan and many of those other countries?
Most definitely. So when this event, it's been going on, it's an ongoing issue.
Yes,
you know,
people have been talking about this for a while.
Exactly. And so we decided, instead of, on top of the incremental reporting that we were doing, we launched a website, Hunger Across Africa, that is dedicated solely for this subject, so that people can come and see, you know, there's an interactive map that really walks people through what's happening, causes, we categorize things by causes, response, solutions, so that it breaks down. And factors vary from one place to another. You know, armyworms are decimating farms in southern parts of Africa, and if you go to the Horn, you know, weather conditions like El Nino and La Nina have really decimated farms, people who are not really able to farm, farmers who are not able to you know, make ends meet.
So people can learn a lot about what's going on and how they can help through your website, project.voanews.com/Africa Drought.
Hunger Across Africa, yes, that's
right.
right.
Right now, as you see this situation developing, has the international response been adequate to the severity of the problem?
The short answer is no. Earlier this year, the UN pledged for $6.1 billion, and only since last month or this month, they've been able to raise $2.2 billion. That's not enough. The US has been leading in the, in fact, I was just covering, and they had a subcommittee, congressional meeting about this. They were able, in May, they were able, with the leadership of Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey, and Congresswoman Karen Bass, they were able to pass a bill, $1 billion for family relief.
You were at that hearing on Capitol Hill. Does that, are you more optimistic now than you were before, or less so?
Well, the mood, especially now because of the proposed, Trump's administration proposed budget, you know, it really, the mood was not really, you know, of worries. People are worried about that.
It's not enough to deal with the severity of the problem.
It's not. In fact, the proposed bill, a blueprint, shows that there's going to be 31% cut from U.S. aid, and also eliminating FuseNet, which is the body that really tracks and basically, you know, addresses these issues, and that's been worrisome. But what Congressman Smith told me when I asked him this question is that, you know, the president could pass it. This is a blueprint. Congress is the body that decides.
I've got like 10 seconds left. The fact that the United States has withdrawn from the Paris Accord, is that a source of worry?
Well, you know, surprisingly, most African countries are still in that accord. So, but, you know, climate conditions still affect.
It's a question of leadership, isn't it?
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Salem. I wish we had more time to talk about this, but that's all the time we have. We'll be back again next week, though, for another edition of The Correspondents. In the meantime, do stay up to date with all the news at voanews.com. You can also see all of our shows there. Just click on the Watch tab. We're also on Facebook and YouTube. I'm Milar Sega. Thanks for watching. For now, so long from Washington.